Hi, my name is Brianna Rondero, and I will be talking about the movie As Good as It Gets and the diagnosis of Mr. Melvin Udall, a character in the movie. This is an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to start by explaining Mr. Melvin Udall. He's a character in the movie As Good as It Gets. He's known as being upfront, rude, and angry to those who come to meet him. The movie starts when his gay neighbor Simon is assaulted and taken to the hospital. Mr. Udall is entrusted with his dog, who forms an unlikely bond with it, resulting in him becoming nicer and softer to those around him. Meanwhile, his favorite waitress, Carol, at his usual restaurant, has to leave work to take care of her sick son, making it impossible for him to eat breakfast there every morning. Mr. Udall struggles with his compulsivity as he attempts to bond with Carol and Simon on a trip to Baltimore. So, I'm going to go into explaining the big five traits and how Mr. Udall exhibits them. Openness is the first one, and it's the interest in new experiences or ideas, and it's characterized by a level of curiosity and imagination one has. Mr. Udall, it scores pretty low on this. He's not very keen to new experiences and struggles to go to new places and meet new people. This is shown when he struggles to agree to take Simon to see his parents in Baltimore, and also happens when he's given a new server at his daily restaurant. The second is conscientiousness, and it's the amount of control and organization one likes to exhibit. Some traits associated with this is being punctual, ambitious, and hardworking. Mr. Udall scores pretty high on this. He likes to plan and organize a lot of things, including trips and itineraries, and actually does this in the movie when he plans the trip to Baltimore. Organization of his surroundings and belongings. He exhibits this several times throughout the movie, and he likes to have control over the situations he's in. Some examples are when he's packing for his trip to Baltimore, he lays everything out in neat rows and makes sure everything is there and uses a list and everything. He becomes anxious over not having the right attire at a restaurant, and he seems to feel a little ridiculous and like he's calling attention to himself. And a third one is when he's adamant about finding treatment for Carol's son's illness just for her to go back to being his waitress at his favorite restaurant. Extroversion is how sociable, outgoing, and confident an individual is. Mr. Udall is not very extroverted. He stays at home and works on his novels, and while he is talkative, he's very rude and closed off to meeting new people. He talks about his father not leaving his childhood home for 6 years, which could explain some of his introversion. Agreeableness is how friendly, warm, trusting, generous, or good-natured a person is. Mr. Udall scores very low on this trait. He's very rude to others and often chooses to point out flaws and insult them. A good example of this is when there's a Jewish couple sitting in his usual spot at the restaurant, and he chooses to insult them on their looks and religion. Neuroticism is how anxious, worrying, tense, and emotional or high-strung someone is. Mr. Udall scores pretty high on this. He's very high-strung and tense, and usually exhibits this when his routine or plans are changed abruptly. An example, again, is having the wrong attire for the restaurant, and he decides to go to a store and buy a suit and tie instead of using the restaurant's. Another example is when he finds Simon sketching Carol naked on the bed, and he's really mad, thinking that they had sex even though Simon is gay. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is characterized by the presence of obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are recurrent thoughts, urges, and imagery, and these are normally unwanted by the individual, and the individual tries to neutralize or suppress these by performing a compulsive act. Compulsions are repetitive actions or behaviors that are driven by rules set by the individual. These are normally used to reduce anxiety or stress associated with a trigger. Compulsions are normally connected in a way that's unrealistic and used to prevent or reduce anxiety. Some other characteristics of OCD are obsessions and compulsions are normally time-consuming or cause stress in social situations. Symptoms are not caused by physiological effects of substances such as drugs or alcohol, and symptoms are not better explained by another mental illness. Some obsessive traits exhibited by Mr. Udall. It's kind of hard to really clear up some of these because he doesn't really give an explanation for his obsessions or his compulsion. But some of them seem to be concerned with safety and cleanliness. One obsession he does exhibit and is explained is his infatuation with the waitress Carol, who's the only waitress that will serve him at the restaurant. He goes as far as to pay for his son's treatment after she takes time off to take care of her son, just so she can go back to eating breakfast there every day. Some compulsive acts exhibited by Mr. Udall is not walking on sidewalk cracks and entryways. One of the examples is when he walks Simon's dog. He makes sure not to step on the cracks and actually gets really excited when the dog follows his lead. Another instance is when he shows up to the tailor shop and is unwilling to step into the entryway because of the tile on the floor. And it's unclear why Udall acts on these compulsions, but it's still there. Another compulsion he exhibits is locking the door several times after he comes into the apartment and only walks away when he's content with it. Some missing symptoms of Mr. Udall is that he seems to lack high levels of anxiety when he can't seem to act on his obsessions and compulsions. He seems to be able to put himself in new situations after meeting Carol and tries to ignore his symptoms when she decides to pursue a romantic relationship with him, which is not something that most people can do in real life. A possible course of treatment for Mr. Udall is exposure and response prevention and medication. ERP is a gradual exposure to an obsession or trigger and is usually paired with learning coping mechanisms for anxiety, which would help him identify and cope with his behaviors. Antidepressants are normally issued to individuals with elevated levels of anxiety, so I'd recommend not pursuing this course of treatment unless he exhibits higher levels of anxiety. The portrayal of OCD in As Good as It Gets seems to be pretty accurate in terms of Mr. Udall's tendencies and behaviors. It does a good job of portraying the time consumption of behaviors and the impact it has on Mr. Udall connecting with those around him. The one thing that is pretty inaccurate is the conclusion of the movie when Mr. Udall and Carol engage in a romantic relationship, and he seems to have an easier time finding ways to cope with his behaviors, and which is not as easy for people in real life to get rid of or cope with. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening in. Have a good day.